So what we're going to do today is we're going to basically take everything we did yesterday, that last exercise especially. Can you remember when I organized your questions into those categories, basically? That's where we're going to be starting from, because yesterday those were formulated as questions, as challenges, as issues that we wanted to know how to tackle. And today we're going to start looking at how to tackle them. And what we've done from a research perspective is kind of used anything we could find to try and find some best practice kind of to tackle some of these issues. So but that's mostly from written documentation. And again, as I was saying, a lot of this documentation comes from Latin America especially. We did have some case studies in 5 different countries, so we also took experience from there. But you'll probably find that there's elements missing. You might not feel reflected in some of the things we say, and that's why the session afterwards will really be focused on your understanding of what the best practice is and kind of your inputs to this based on your country experience. So the pillars are the same ones that we were looking at yesterday. You'll see yesterday I'd organized it into 5 different groups. Here we have 4 because I've grouped the policy and the kind of cost and budget pillar basically. So the first one we're looking at is policy and budget. The second one is administrative and institutional structure. The third is the implementation structure, which is very much linked to the design. So these are the kind of the operational aspects, and this includes issues around targeting, which aren't necessarily there, but could be important issues that you need to be facing. And then we have the technological infrastructure. So one by one, that's what we're going to be looking at. So to start with, the first pillar, policy and budget. And this is kind of rotates around having a social protection strategy in place, basically. And so key learning that came out from our research was that there is no way that you can kind of decide that you want an integrated system for managing data and information for social protection and call in some IT experts and get them to integrate for you. That's not the order in which these things work. And I just wanted Richard to very quickly share an example. Richard, do you have a microphone or do you want to jump up here? Richard, to share an example of an experience he had where things went slightly wrong.
Yeah. So I think just to give you a quick example. Yeah, so there was, recently I just got contacted by a friend in Rwanda to give a bit of a comment on a particular model which they were actually developing for setting up an integrated data and information management for the country. So I looked through, there was a subcommittee, there was a main national steering committee, and there was a subcommittee which was actually established consisting of IT people. So I think the policymakers thought, for example, what we can do is just delegate this particular role to this particular small group who are mostly actually the IT people to give. So when I looked at the diagram of the entire conceptual design of the framework, there were things like gateway, linking things, and I thought, for example, there was a lot of things which were not going to make a lot of sense to the policymakers, okay, in terms of the way the structure was. But I looked at this was something that was done, for example, 3 years ago, and the country has been going around in circles because, for example, this is something which was delegated to technical people, and there was no policy leadership in terms of the drive to actually set up things. So it's actually a very good example in terms of if you leave the design of the entire integrated system to IT alone, you'll not be able to get the solutions. So ideally, what needs to happen is the technology needs to come in later as a solution to you. And technology is not particularly a problem. In fact, yesterday, I think you'll see, Valentina, when you are classifying the issues, there was no challenge related to technology. I know it's not very empirical study, but it just tells us, for example, out of 19 countries, everybody had issues and challenges around all other clusters, all the other 3, but there was no issue around technology. So technology seems to be something that works, but you don't bring it fast. Okay, you don't actually jump the gun and then bring it to be the first the issue, because I think if you do that, then you actually create more problems for you. So you need to be able to take the leadership. So we don't want to see technology being the first thing to actually resolve for you. You need to bring it at the right time when you've decided exactly the model that you actually want for yourself. Thank you.
So thank you, Richard, for an empirical example. I also liked kind of one of the comments from the Turkey group kind of yesterday, saying kind of once we'd got all the arrangements and all the people on board and everyone, and we had the strategy, that the technology was easy. I mean, you can even build kind of an amazing web service system, but what that comes afterwards, that just flows. And same speaking to the MIS developers in Kenya. So that's the technical people say, look, if I get clear specifications from the policy people of what they want, why they're doing this, what's the project, what's the vision, then I can easily solve their technology problems. So best practice, having very clear objectives. So why are we doing this? What are we aiming at? Kind of why are we trying to integrate? We looked yesterday at some of the main reasons why we may want to be integrating. Those may not all resonate, but quite a few of those may be some good objectives, and possibly kind of having those objectives reflected in the national strategy, national social protection strategy. So really having kind of a strong leadership and clear policy guidance of why integration is important and where it's going. Generally, of course, also commitment to a holistic and integrated approach to social protection helps. So trying to tackle people's problems across the life cycle, kind of depending on the risks that they're facing at various stages of life, or depending on disasters or any other shocks that they may be facing. And this is something that is very much reflected, for example, in the Chile experience, where the whole drive for integration was driven by a conceptualization of poverty, which was integrated. So you're looking at the multidimensional aspects of poverty and how you can tackle those multidimensional aspects of poverty. So integration was really at the heart of the drive for IT integration as well, but that was a second step. And of course, this is partially also reflected in some of the social protection floor kind of initiative. This is something that came to me from quite a few of the policy people that we interviewed during the study, is also this acceptance of a slow, iterative process and of failures along the way. So again, there isn't kind of, you can't just say I want to integrate, snap, kind of it happens. This is kind of something that takes time. It needs leadership. It needs commitment. Writing up a strategy isn't something that happens overnight. So it's a slow process, and accepting failures is part of that process. On the budget side of things, it would be useful to kind of have some form of an upfront assessment of costs. That's not always easy, and kind of very often costs, especially at the setup stage, can actually be quite high and daunting. One thing that actually surprised me was how many countries, even ones I wasn't expecting, had received external development partner financing to set up their integrated kind of management information systems and single registries. So I've put this hand figure here, and you'll see this throughout the presentation. I just wanted a show of hands. So if you can raise your hand, if your country received some form of donor development partner financing to help set up your single registry and integrated management information system. So if you can raise your hands now. So that's quite a high, that's definitely a majority, I would say. So that's interesting. It kind of shows that especially at that initial development stage, kind of that external financing has had an important role. It's quite difficult to compare costs in general across countries, so it's quite difficult to come up with a recipe. How much will it cost to set up this system? So you can divide between various categories of costs. So implementation costs, we found, were between $0.2 million and $9 million on a yearly basis. Data collection costs ranged between $4 and $14 per application. I know that Indonesia is very proud that they are very much on the lower range for this. And development infrastructure costs range between $1 and $5 million. So Richard wants to say something.
I think I wanted to say that I think in terms of the costing, it would, just to echo what Valentina said, it would vary, but sometimes it makes sense if you're going to be investing it to do a bit of quick feasibility. Because what it does is just determines your country, the benefits that you would have. And also it lays a very good foundation later on in terms of how the whole mechanics will actually roll out. So I think investing in feasibility, for example, expert advice would actually help in terms of also determining the costs. Because I think there are also formulas that could be used also to determine an IT cost. And the cost alone is not just the cost of the software and the hardware. There is a total cost of ownership. Because sometimes you go into an investment where you have, for example, maintenance costs annually for the more or less like 5 years. So you need to think through. So all that needs to be consolidated together so that you know that the entire costing will give you a clear view of what you're actually investing in. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, we were discussing yesterday, for example, there's the choice between, and Richard will be talking about this later, the choice between buying a ready-made package kind of for your MIS or building it up yourself. What's more cost effective? And it's very different if you just compare the initial cost of the package or if then you're comparing over time how much it will cost you for every single tweak, every single update. If you buy a pre-packaged service, then the cost of that tweaking might be incredibly high. So they are things that you need to be considering from the start. Of course, one thing I wanted to say on these ranges of costs is that we haven't divided these by population. So that 0.2 million is Costa Rica, very small country. 9 million will be a much larger country. So of course the size and entity of your country. Yesterday we were discussing with Sanjay of the one state of India which is as big as the whole of Turkey. So of course you'll be facing very different challenges. The last point I wanted to make on this budget side is that cost effectiveness can be shown. So Turkey apparently kind of made, I didn't hear it myself, but that you guys managed to recover the costs of this project within 2 payment cycles. So that's pretty impressive in terms of cost recovery of kind of such a big investment. And that of course is the case if maybe you had a lot of recipients beforehand kind of receiving duplicate benefits. So it's also about combating fraud, double dipping and all of those issues. Okay, so I'm now moving to the second pillar. I realize this is actually quite difficult to read on this screen, but the second pillar is about administrative and institutional aspects. So I'll be looking at kind of governance issues, and this came up a lot yesterday, kind of what is the right governance for these kind of integrated systems. The administrative structure, and especially kind of issues around decentralization. A lot of the countries, even represented in this room, were kind of, they felt a tickle because they said, okay, we can try and centralize, but we've got these very powerful decentralized governments. How do we deal with them? I mean, they have different needs, they have different requests, they actually resist our inputs, they don't want us to be centralizing. And then the third issue, which I said didn't really come up yesterday, which is around staff availability, capacity, training and retention. Okay, so governance and institutional arrangements. What did we find was the best practice based on our research? So something that came out very strongly was the need for the kind of centralization of the management and coordination functions in an independent and kind of high enough in government hierarchy institution. And that is not necessarily very easy to achieve, because you need a champion, you need strong leadership from someone very high up in government to set something like this up. I know, I mean, in some countries in Latin America, the management of these integrated systems is it's approved with a kind of supreme decree, presidential decree, and the units are set up very high in the government hierarchy. And what does this mean in practice? That they have the opportunity to coordinate with a wide range of actors, they have the bargaining power, they don't have that slightly remissive attitude of social development, social protection ministries, who by definition they're lower down in that government hierarchy compared to stronger ministries, health, education, finance. So the next question maybe is, how do you ensure that this happens, that you have this unit which is high up enough? Indonesia, I know, for example, they have an interesting situation because they have a very strong unit which is quite high up, kind of within this TNP2K, but it's not fully institutionalized in the government. And yesterday in our session, Pak Darno was really talking about this as a challenge. Third point, embedded in legislation. So as much as possible, again, the many of the Latin American cases, for example, the existence of the integrated management information system for social protection is actually, it's fully recognized within the country's legislation, and it's mandated by legislation. And Turkey, actually, one of the first steps they said that they had to go through was to make sure that sharing of data and in general the existence of the single registry was recognized and endorsed by the legislation. So that's a useful, I mean, once you have that, then going forward is a lot easier. And fourth, this clear identification of stakeholders and formalization of their roles and responsibilities. So yes, kind of a lot of this is about building those relationships kind of with other ministries, getting them on board, convincing them, all the kind of soft, informal networking. But there also needs to be some kind of a formalization. So memorandums of understanding, design of incentives, for example, even with local authorities. So I'm not talking just about higher level government institutions, even lower level institutions. So the countries that have succeeded in having kind of a good network of relationships and sharing. I mean, yesterday that the word sharing of information, how do we get other governments to share their data? Information is power. So how do you convince other people to share their information with you? It's about a kind of mutual exchange. It's about kind of formalizing the relationship, again, legally. I wanted another raise of hands here on how many countries, how many of you have actually formalized these relationships with other government authorities and local level authorities with legal kind of written agreements, memorandums of understanding. If you could raise your hands. Okay. So it's a lower percentage, but I can see that a lot of the countries that have succeeded already in high levels of integration, they have this level of kind of formalization. So thank you for. I would quite like to have someone take note of who's raising their hands. This is a great survey again for my research. Okay. There are some trade-offs, of course, and kind of some of this is around the transaction cost to coordination. So as probably a lot of you who are involved in the kind of policy level side of things, it just takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, a lot of convincing, a lot of meetings, so big transaction costs. You'll probably have 1 or 2 staff within your unit that are almost doing this full time, especially in the initial stages. So there can be frustrations there. And there are some risks of errors being propagated just with this kind of centralized kind of approach of having this strong hierarchical approach. Okay. Third dimension, administrative structure and decentralization. So actually quite a few of the countries we studied did have a decentralized system, kind of a decentralized governments, and so a lot of them were facing these issues of local governments resisting this power coming from above, saying you should be collecting data this way, we'll be giving you information on who you should target. Many local governments want to be creating their own programs for political reasons. They have high incentives, sometimes possibly to include candidates that they want to be including in their local programs. So the fact that one central authority comes in and says, we have the answer, we're going to tell you who to target in an objective fashion, centralized fashion, there will be resistance. So what many countries have done is they have decentralized implementation, which also kind of giving ownership to local governments in terms of they're the branches who are implementing, for example, a lot of the data collection process, and centralization of the design and control functions. So the design of the targeting methodology, whether it's a PMT or another method, and having that kind of the more day-to-day tasks being performed at decentralized level. So that was the case we found in Turkey, it's the case in Chile, it's the case in Argentina, it's the case in Brazil. This isn't necessarily easy. I mean, how do you get a network of local governments who maybe don't want to be cooperating to actually be your operational branches? So how do you get them to cooperate in such a way that is actually useful for your purposes? And of course, some of it is about kind of having those memorandums of understanding, some of it is about providing money, and so decentralization also of the financing process. And Brazil is an interesting case study here. I'm sure that you probably talked about this yesterday, Jennifer, but Brazil has developed this decentralized management index and performance incentives that are linked to it. So the municipalities are obliged to cooperate with the Cadastro Único, so they're obliged to collect the data, process the data, and hand it over. But if they don't do it, they get less financing basically for the next period. So it's a delicate system to manage, but it's definitely one to be used as a potential example for other countries. Of course, the decentralization goes both ways, so you can't just ask for things without giving anything back. So again, another best practice was kind of for information to be kind of, once it's been gathered, once it's been processed, verified, validated, we'll be looking at all of this later, for it to be shared back with the local institutions, kind of ideally through web access, but also it's okay even if it's through a batch process, kind of just sending a CD with the data on it, just making sure that the local governments also have access to this data, that they can do their own monitoring and evaluation. Maybe they can be developing their own kind of social policies as add-ons to the central policy that you are implementing. So I know that even in Indonesia this is the case. So you have, for example, the national Jamkesmas health insurance, and then local governments have been adapting and creating their own add-on health insurance programs, kind of for those beneficiaries they felt had been left out from the national system. So it takes some flexibility from the national level, kind of to accept this tailoring, kind of using the national data. So the challenges are these disincentives of local authorities. So they want to, I mean, again, this is political economy, but it's about kind of them having an interest on having control over who is receiving what in their constituency. Having, in general, central government has quite low enforcement capacity on lower levels of government. So you can use some of this stick and carrot techniques, but from an enforcement point of view, there's not much power there. And in general, of course, there's web access is not always possible, and decentralization of implementation requires capacity at local level. So if you don't have that capacity, if you don't have that network of kind of municipality staff that actually have additional time available for some of these roles, or if you don't have a network of social assistants that can be collecting data for you, then all of this is not possible in the first place. Okay, staff availability, capacity, training, and retention. So this links to what I was just saying. Kind of the first, kind of this, it is an important issue, is how much staff do I need for to implement this? And the national units that we looked at in various countries have varied quite largely in size. So again, I'd like a show of hands for anyone who has more than 30 staff in their national unit dealing with the kind of central single registry. More than 30. So Pakistan, Turkey, Chile, Brazil, and Indonesia. So that's, yeah, again, and I'll ask this. I'll ask my research questions later, but that's interesting. How many would have between 10 and 29 staff in their national central units? No. Yeah. How many have kind of between 10 and I've said 10 and 30. So 10 to 30 staff within the central unit. Nobody. Okay, down there we've got Cambodia. No. And how many have less than 10 staff? Less than 10 staff, Kenya, Lesotho, and Mozambique. So that's interesting just to see the distribution of manpower. How much manpower do you need leading this? It's not easy if you have less than 10 staff at central level. Yes. How many how many have a unit at all? No. Does Bangladesh, yeah. What's your answer to that question? No, how many have no unit at all? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay. Okay, so we have Bangladesh here as a... Are there others who don't have any unit at all? Okay, so Lao... Wow, what is the maximum staff? Wow. Pakistan. 2,000. But that's Nadra. Yeah. Yeah. So Nadra. Should we give you a microphone a second? Yeah.
This is Nadra, which is maintaining the national database for the citizens of Pakistan, and they are also managing social protection programs, all the social protection programs.
Yeah, so Pakistan has a very interesting situation because they have the Nadra, the civil registry, which has a role in managing social protection programs. So that's why their staffing is so big. But 2,000 is impressive.
Total 8,000 employees all over the country.
Are we including the data entry teams? Because I could see Samuel from Kenya
No, so we were talking about the central unit. So at local level, then you'd have this network of staff. And in some cases, it would be staff that it's not directly under your management. So for example, if it's municipality staff, then you're not directly managing them, which constitutes a problem from a management perspective, as we were saying before. Or you could have your own staff, which kind of social assistants, social workers, that you actually have direct management control over. How many people have more than 40,000 local staff? 40,000 local staff kind of working. Maybe Brazil. I remember reading a paper where, I think you definitely had something that's... Yeah. So of course this is completely linked to population as well. So it's slightly misrepresentative, kind of to use the number of staff as an example. But it's interesting to give an idea of the range we have in the room. Okay, I'm gonna move on. So whether you have or you don't have this staff is an issue, and again it's about taking a step back. If you're developing a system, kind of how many staff may I need? I think sometimes it's more than you expect. And then once you have the staff, it's about kind of providing the incentives and the training for the staff, so that you not only you have the retention, kind of staff are not going off and taking up jobs anywhere else, but you also have the capacity and to implement your project. So what are the best practice coming from the countries that we looked at? So first of all, design a very strong manuals. Now, writing a manual is one of the most boring things that exists on this planet, but it's essential, and it's essential that it's actually written by quite high-level people. So having a standardized approach across the country, especially if you with a big population, having a strong reference manual on processes and how these should be implemented is essential. And sometimes it's not always the case. It's surprising how many countries actually don't have a manual on how data should be collected, processed, entered, validated. These processes should all be documented. Ongoing training. So a one-off training is not enough. Staff turnover is actually quite high, especially at the local level. So having an approach, kind of standardized approach to ongoing training, having thematic working groups, and online education consultations. I think this was Chile that does online consultations. Is that correct? Or I can't remember what country that comes from, but okay. And of course the challenges are still kind of, it can be an issue to kind of provide this training to motivate capable staff, again, especially at local level, and building that network at local level. My last point, I think, is an interesting one that actually comes more from the academic literature. So there's a big stream of academic literature looking at IT failure, especially in low-income countries, and why do kind of these big IT projects fail? And very often one of the factors identified is the lack of a hybrid figure. Now, what do we mean by hybrid? This is a hybrid, something which has two souls, two different aspects to it. So this, you can see, has the crocodile and the frog coming together. So the crocodile we could think of as the IT kind of being on top of things, snappy, kind of focused on the more technical aspects, and the frog is the policy side, kind of being able to leap from one issue to another, to have I'm pushing things a bit, but I wanted to make a point. So is he more of a frog or a crocodile? More of a crocodile. So a hybrid figure is someone who can actually shares the language of the IT people, which is quite technical, very focused, and kind of what they want is kind of for the business processes to be mapped out so that then they can make the right linkages, and the policy people who are constantly making new requests, thinking wider, kind of wanting to add new elements all the time. So you need a mediator between those two sides of the spectrum. So I found that a really interesting point. Okay, so next we're going to move to implementation. I hope that figure kept your spirits alive, that beautiful half frog, half crocodile hybrid. The next aspect we're looking at is the operational implementation aspects. So this is another topic that a lot of your questions were focused around yesterday. And again, these clusters are actually the ones that we're going to be discussing in the various groups afterwards. So you'll have a lot of time to discuss your country experience of what your best practice was kind of in the next session. I'm just giving you an overview of what the literature has been saying and what we found in our report. So the main issues we'll be looking at are the collection of data, transforming data into information, linking databases, updating of data, but also issues around targeting and integrating other services. So, collection of data. One question that came up a couple of times yesterday was, what data do we actually collect? And it's a tough question because it really depends on what you need for your program and who you want to be targeting, what type of information you want to be retaining, even for public interest. Maybe you have a wider set of questions that it's useful to have in that integrated database that are not immediately useful, but they might be useful in the longer term. Of course, the recommendation would be to keep data to a minimum, because every single piece of information you're collecting has a cost, and it increases the complexity of your system. But at the same time, it's not very easy to contain the amount of data. So, for example, this is page 2 of the Cadastro Único questionnaire, and this questionnaire is 29 pages long. So that's a long questionnaire. I can estimate, kind of as a researcher having done quite a bit of fieldwork, that's an hour and a half interview, at least. So that's a long time to be dedicating to each interview. I have a show of hands here. I'd like to know how many of you have questionnaires that are more than, let's say, 28 pages, so we can include Brazil. Questionnaires with more than 28 pages. Page, again, is a silly indicator, because what counts is the number of questions you're asking. Yeah. but it just gives you a sense of the... No. Brazil, 55 questions. Maybe I should be asking number of questions. Toby. Should I ask? Because the reason I was asking about number of pages is I thought you'd remember better compared to the number of questions. But would you remember that number of questions? Who has more than 100 questions in their questionnaire? Anyway, this is silly, but I think one thing which I would quite like to do, and Joanna will be talking about this afterwards, is some of this kind of just looking at what other countries have done, for example, with their questionnaires for their single registry. Kind of what information are other countries asking for? It would be quite useful to have a repository of different countries' questionnaires, for example. Just to kind of be able to compare what's the key information that everybody's asking, kind of maybe I could be asking this question, is this important for me? That would be quite useful to have a go-to reference place for this. The Cadastro Único one is online. Okay, next issue, which is quite an important one. There's a lot of stuff being written on this, and you've probably read it all, about the advantages and disadvantage of having on-demand registration versus census methods. So just kind of to make sure we all understand each other, on-demand is when you have an administrative office and people can go and apply there whenever they want throughout the year. So it's kind of application-based. While a census method is a group of interviewers going door to door and making sure that they're interviewing every single person, or at least every person who's been pre-identified as poor. So those are the two main methods. So I'll briefly talk you through some of the advantages and disadvantages of each. The on-demand registration has lower total costs because of the self-selection process. So only people who are applying for social assistance are going and making that application. So overall, you'll probably be filling in less paperwork. It's a dynamic, ongoing system, so it allows to capture the dynamics of poverty better, especially kind of new people who are suddenly entering. They've had maybe a shock, so they're entering a situation where they need social assistance. It's more democratic in a sense, and it's a permanent process, and that can help to maintain local structures if you have any. If you don't have any local structures, then that's just not an option. So, yeah.
I think the on-demand registration, there is also a real risk of exclusion, because as we have often seen, the bottom of the pyramid often don't volunteer, either because of lack of confidence in the system.
That's what, yeah, so I'm gonna come to the other side of the picture. So it's theoretically, in fact, I've got democratic in brackets, even in my notes. Because the other side of the picture is that you have, the poorest people are the ones who are most likely to be less informed, to have kind of be less confident, kind of more stigmatized, less, so having a census approach that's going door to door is more likely to capture that type of people. In fact, what they say is that the on-demand registration is more appropriate for area where there's lower poverty levels and more heterogeneous poverty, where the registry is very well known. Everyone knows about it, and everyone knows that you have to apply for social assistance. It's not a new program that's just started that no one really knows that it's there, and where, of course, you have the network of offices that is available. While the census methods are better suited for higher poverty rates, so even 70% plus poverty rates, more homogeneous, high density poverty, and, for example, a fast starting new register. We have a question there. I want to just say one last thing before I get the question on. it's interesting that while I said that the total costs are lower for the on-demand system, the marginal costs can actually be lower for the census system, and that's because of the economies of scale per household. So we need to factor that in. So Pakistan has a comment here.
Thank you, Valentina. In fact, we have just been through this process for recertification, and we are just in the process of formulating the proposals. Like we considered many options. Like one is the demand option, and the other is the census. And then the third one was the combination of the two. But you see, even in the combination of the two approaches, there are a lot of risks involved. Number one is, as you said, that you can go for census where there is the poverty incidence is more as compared to the areas where the demand approach can be adopted. But you see, this is for the researchers and for the policy makers to understand where to go for census and where not to go for census. But on the ground, people don't understand this. So there is an inbuilt political risk into this process, the combination approach, because it's a political economy. We all understand. Like, for example, if I go to one district for census, where there is the incidence of poverty is more than compared to the other districts, but this point will be hard to understand by the political people or the people who
Why
are,
them and not us?
Yeah. So
Absolutely.
there's a big question. So what we concluded after 5-6 months of deliberations and all these, that the best approach is to go for a census, so that there are no point fingering that these are included, that they are excluded, and so on, and the political the reputational risks.
Okay, no, thank you. That's very interesting, actually. This again, it's an element of decentralization in a very large country, definitely to keep in mind. One thing I wanted to say is that, so here I've written that the best practice can be to combine the two. So what I mean by this is having a scheduled census, possibly kind of, let's say, every 3 years, and then having some form of a system for ongoing applications. So you're not missing out of the net those people who are entering poverty in the meanwhile. One, of course, the incentive here is that it's much less likely that people come and report that they're a lot better now, thank you very much, I have a great job, big new salary, so I don't want your assistance anymore. So that's why, in a sense, having a survey census every 3 years is quite helpful also to capture those who are graduating out of poverty, and that's the approach in Chile, for example. So that's what I mean by combining the two approaches. So it's true that to have one approach in one area and one approach in another is probably politically impossible, kind of within a country. Okay. This we went into yesterday. I just kind of, if you remember the 4 models, you can hardly see them on the screen, but the centralized model, the program-centered model, the virtual model, those consolidated model. So those were the 4 models we looked at yesterday. As we said yesterday, I just wanted to repeat this. These are 4 approaches also to collecting data. Kind of what do you do? Do you use data already from one program? Do you try and consolidate things across, or existing data across governments like Turkey has done? Your options depend on what you have, so there's no approach which is best, but it's worth considering which might fit your country best. And then, of course, collecting data as much as possible as a side product of program operations. I mean, this can be difficult to organize administratively, but it lowers those collection costs. The trade-offs we've already gone through. Each piece of information has a cost. If countries may feel stuck because of their historical trajectory. So what do we do if we don't have a network of staff? What do we do? And the third one is linked to the example that Indonesia gave us yesterday. So very innovative approach that they utilized, kind of having the census as a basis, then having a very complex kind of linkage with other data sources in order to map the areas and the 40%, 45% of population that were poorest, and then going for an additional interview to that 45% poorest households, using staff from the statistical agency. So this is not done in other countries, And it's incredible that Indonesia has managed to achieve this, partially because there's, of course, a natural resistance from the statistics agency, who doesn't want to feel involved in issues around targeting. The incentives for misreporting may kind of increase if they are associated with poverty targeting and social assistance. So it's risky, but it's a very interesting module given the constraints that Indonesia was facing. And so, again, I mean, you have to balance these considerations out. Okay, I'm going to hand on to Richard. We have these nice splits. I hand him over when I'm tired. I just go, you go.
Thanks, Valentina, for that. So we'll continue with the discussing about the nuts and the bolts, the frog. So I think we'll not be looking at that. We're looking at more about the frog now. The crocodiles has already been more or less like covered by Valentina. Yeah. So I think we are looking at transforming data into information. So we've now dealt with the collection of the data. So we want to see exactly, so in terms of the transforming the data, what are the best practices out there based on the research? So I think we all know that I think one of the critical things to look at is the accuracy of the information, correctness, currency, completeness, and relevance. I'm not sure how that is coming out very well in terms of the translation, especially to Portuguese and Mandarin. So I think in terms of the critical thing is to be able to, in terms of the definitions, I want to quickly clarify in terms of what do we mean by verification, what do we mean by updating, and what do we mean by validation. So in terms of verifying, I think the examples we got yesterday, including the ones from Brazil, is in terms of verification, you're looking for an external check. I know, for example, that with NADRA, for example, with BISP in Pakistan, there was an external company or a firm that was contracted to do a check in terms of the, to validate, to verify the data, to check its accuracy. So there was actually, they did a bit of, they said 95%, okay? But you could also do a check, automatic check. So we know, for example, we do verification of the national ID and other pieces of information in Pakistan with NADRA database, which is another external database. We do a similar thing, for example, with the programs in Kenya. We do a check with the 30 million population database. So this is what we call verification, checking against an external data source. Okay? So in terms of validation, we are talking about ensuring the completeness, ensuring the consistency. So I think what you'd want to do in this particular case is the management information system that you actually build should be able to have these particular essential controls. So you don't want, for example, the date format. I've actually worked before on a project in Zimbabwe where the National Statistics Bureau gave us some data, and the date formats were having 999/999, say, for example, 1978. Because for this particular Statistics Bureau, where there was no date and month of birth, they would give you 999. They didn't want to actually more or less like default or particular. But of course, what we know, for example, is that may become a challenge depending on the databases. For example, say in Turkey, when you're using Oracle or you're using some other bigger databases, that becomes a bit of a problem. So there's consistency checks that need to be built into your management information system to ensure that it actually works very well. That is called validation. In terms of updating, we are looking at the currency of the information, and I think Valentina has already spoken to that, in the sense that if you're doing a census, if you're doing more or less like an update of your registry after 2 years, that might be very okay, but you want to ensure that there is a bit of a means in which this information could potentially be updated more regularly through some interview process or through some an on-demand process. So you want to have that. I think the biggest challenge you face is the budgets. So if there is a bit of a delay in terms of the length, the frequency of the update, and you go, for example, for a 10-year period, what it means is you're actually potentially excluding a vulnerable group, potentially vulnerable group of people. So you actually more or less like it leads into big exclusion error that you actually create because you're actually maintaining a particular database that is not actually current. And of course, I think the other critical important thing to think about when you think about transforming the data is reporting. We all know, for example, that we all build these management information systems. We also achieve this particular level of integration to be able to report, to create some reports, some actually useful reports. So I think we saw yesterday Turkey's model, and we saw that nice chart, which was very nice. I think in IT terminology, we call it actually the dashboards. So I think for policymakers, for example, I think for many years' experience that I've actually dealt with management information systems, most policymakers don't want to go into the system and then they try to run a complex query to extract the information. What they want is just to see the dashboard. How many beneficiaries have we covered? They want to see very nice graphs. And sometimes it can be actually added to the maps that actually creates a lot of more power and more appeal. So I think, for example, dashboards actually are becoming more and more common way in which, for example, we transform the information out of our MIS into some very, very nice way in which we do the presentations. So we have that. And of course, I think, so if we are talking about verification, validation, updating, and then also reporting. Okay, I think I've got a...
Can we, ensure the accuracy with the dashboard or any business intelligence tool?
You could, I think the essence is, there are two areas of actually maintaining that particular accuracy. The first part is you need to ensure that your data first is accurate. The data that you kept in your database, that's the first part. Yeah. But also, your business intelligence tool in terms of the way it's actually programmed needs to actually be tested also, so that what it does, because you can program a logical error in terms of the calculation. Yeah. So that also needs to be the entire process of ensuring that actually you do very good business intelligence, you get the dashboards, need to be validated also, so that whatever you get out of your reports is also quite accurate. So you may have, for example, accurate information, but what you don't want is to get some wrong analysis coming out. Because I recall yesterday when we were having the discussion with the team from Turkey, they were talking about, we were asking about graduation. How many beneficiaries have graduated out of the program? And I think that was quite a sticky issue all over. I mean, I also saw it, for example, coming from the discussions yesterday. So if you're asking that particular question, you want a bit of a programmed, all that programmed into some very easy reports that you can see in terms of the graphs as a policymaker. But what you want to do is you want to be involved, and you're going to be discussing later in terms of the development process of the management information system. You want to be involved so that you want to validate that, so that actually you achieve some level of accuracy. You don't want also some errors coming out of as part of the data. I think Valentina wants to speak more into this particular issue.
No, I just quickly wanted to say there's also a huge human element. I mean, you can't expect the computer to...
Yeah.
So it's about having a business process by which you have checks by someone who logically thinks through, kind of, does this make sense? Does this match data I've seen somewhere else? So it's that human element is essential there.
Yeah. So I think that, but I just want to re-emphasize again, because I think yesterday there was a question about ensuring that everyone is clear in terms of these terminologies. So verification, we are checking against external data source. We are bringing in a person to actually sample and actually check for that. Validation, we are ensuring that sorry? Okay. Yeah.
You also have just 5-10% of your interviews being supervised by a supervisor. That is also very good.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then I think you've got validation, and again, you can do a bit of automation of this, ensuring accuracy, building in deduplication checks, not having duplicates. For example, if you got a national ID system, you want to ensure that a beneficiary who has been captured on the system, there is no double entry of that. And most of these, I think in terms of most of the validation, it can actually be achieved quite a lot by a number of inbuilt controls. But also, I think for most of the programs, you take the list. Sometimes you take the potential list of beneficiaries and present to the communities to also to do a bit of validation. That's also part of the validation, I think, as I remember. Then updating, of course, I think I mentioned that, and then I think the element of reporting. In terms of the trade-off, of course, these processes are not very easy. So if you're building, for example, an integrated web service to connect to NADRA, it means you have to commit the programmers to be able to do it. We saw, for example, from Turkey, the entire process. you have to do, for example, memorandum of understanding with the ministries, and then you subsequently have to actually invest in terms of IT resource, in terms of all these particular linkages. If it's a question of verification, and you're actually bringing in a sample and all that supervision to ensure that you actually achieve some level of completeness and all that, you're also doing, you have to ensure that you also invest. So there's also cost element to be actually factored in. Without a unique identifier, that can be used to verify data across the database. There is much less potential for clean, updated data. But of course, I think we have to say this with a bit of caveat. We know Brazil are able to do a bit of cross using what was called, what Jennifer explained very clearly, matching keys. You remember very well, all of us. Yeah, so I think we remember the matching of the keys where they do the name of the mother, the date of birth, the address of the location, and they're able to check, okay? So these are very interesting dimensions. As much you are saying, for example, the best model would be to have a unique ID. Because once you have a unique ID, you have a system like the one for Turkey. But if you cannot, I think Brazilians are telling us, you can still do it. You can still do the cross-check. So I think that's an interesting thing in terms of actually looking at the trade-offs and for that. So in terms of use of the registry data, so I think targeting. And when you talk about targeting, again, I think we've got to mention what we presented yesterday, that the purpose of integration is not only for the purposes, the integrating data and information is not for the sake of targeting, okay? So we've got to actually make that clarification. But we know that for quite a number of countries, the reason why they would integrate data and information is for the targeting purposes. So if that were to be the case, then what it means is, for example, for Indonesia, and for example, for Brazil, for Indonesia specifically, you have, for example, most of the, from our research, we realize that most of the countries, you've got, for example, a system, a scoring system. So you have, for example, all these particular data collected together, then you have some algorithm. In some countries, they use, for example, a targeting system, the proxy means test, which means there is a set of indicators that have some weight. And all these particular thing is consolidated together using some algorithm. I'm not sure, maybe using some formula, maybe there's a better way of actually translating it. And then they are all ranked from the poorest to the richest. So that would be the same case, for example, in Pakistan. The entire 27 million household are actually ranked from the poorest to the richest. A similar case with Indonesia. So you've got all these particular things done. And what you have is the data from these particular registries are subsequently given to the programs to be able to use it. So in terms of the usage, I wanted to explain 3 types of how the data could actually be used. In terms of, so you have, the first is, it can be another additional criteria can be done. So from the data that has actually been done in terms of the ranking, the programs can take this and do some secondary criteria. Okay, so that more or less like the way in which it's actually used. So it can be taken up, for example, and then subsequently used for that particular purpose. The second use, I think, is it could be validated. So there's a validation. The list can actually be validated. The third.
Can I just say this is a different validation from the data validation we were talking about before. So it's the same word, which can be confusing. The validation we were talking about before was the IT data side. This validation is a validation by communities. It's a community process going through the list of selected individuals. Does this feel right to you? Are there people who have been wrongly included, people that should be included that we have not listed? So that's one way that the list generated by the PMT can be used, and many countries adopt this validation, community validation process.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Likewise, the targeting also can be like the term targeting also can be like
the list at the central level also use some targeting, right?
Yeah.
And at the program level also, you have to follow some of the parameters for each program.
Yeah.
So that is also some sort of targeting, right?
Yeah.
So validation twice, targeting twice.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I think you're absolutely right. I think you can call the targeting which is actually applied at a single registry level the primary targeting. So you can call this particular first, second level, maybe call it secondary targeting.
So
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I think the last and the third stage in which the programs can use this particular data is they could say, for example, we are picking 10%, a subset. So one program, for example, so if you had, for example, 4 programs, they could say we are picking the first bottom 10% to actually focus on that. Another program, for example, may focus on graduation, and they actually can pick a particular, so it could be a percentage. So I think that explains, for example, the 3 approaches, how this particular data could be used out of the single registry. So what are the trade-offs? What are the challenges? One challenge is, and I think you can, and you would actually predict very well, when you apply a formula, say for example the proxy means test, to do the ranking, there could be already some inbuilt inclusion and exclusion error that is actually automatically goes into that. So you can have, for example, some systematic exclusion of some households. And I think I want to give a very good example. We know, for example, a system like a proxy means test would look at the number of proxies indicators, one including, for example, the household structure. So you could have an elderly, it takes all that information and converts it into some income or expenditure per elderly equivalent. So for example, you could have an elderly person who was doing very well economically during the productive age. But when they are, for example, at 80 years, they have this particular structure. So it could easily, for example, proxy means test could easily tell you this particular old grandfather or grandmother is doing okay in terms of the weight. So that could potentially be, so there could be some challenges to do with that in terms of the exclusion. The other, I think, the other worry or the other fear in terms of the challenges, and I think this has been expressed before in terms of the critique of actually the single registry, is once you could be systematically, there could be systematic exclusion from other schemes. So, and I think again, this links with the policy of checks against double dipping. So there could be already, for example, that you already multiple schemes. One error could lead to exclusion. So, for example, if there were multiple programs that are already going and collecting the data, what would happen is they have a chance, there's high degree that you can actually pick the beneficiary. But if you make an error and you actually lock everybody in this particular big database, it means now in all these schemes, if there was 10 schemes that use the database, it means if you are not in, it means you are not in for all that, you don't have a chance of actually making into all these other 10 programs. So that explains exactly one of the trade-offs that actually you run into. In terms of the updating of the data, what we found out as part of our research is that a standard practice is to do it every 2 to 3 years. But I just wanted to ask in the form of a question, how many countries actually do it? How many countries do this update? They go back and recollect, refresh the data after every 2 to 3 years. Maybe hands up. Only 3. So let's say how many? So update means you go back again and do a bit of refresh of that particular data. How many do it in 5 years? I can see Chile. I can see Kenya.
So one thing, sorry to clarify, is we've been talking before about the difference between the on-demand and the census method. So this is about that scheduled census every 2 or 3 years, so that you are sure that that on-demand process we said sometimes is not enough, especially for those graduating out of poverty. So we're talking about a scheduled census.
Okay, great. So I think it doesn't. So does. How many don't do it at all? As the final question. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, very interesting. But I think so. If there is an online integration, like the case for Brazil, where, for example, households can come in to the municipality and also update their information, that can also provide a bit of an on-demand process of actually updating. That's one way. So, but I think it goes back to what Valentina was discussing in terms of on-demand versus census. That actually a mix of the two can also ensure a bit of currency, a continuous process in terms of the currency. But also it can also speak to political economy issues. Because if you're only collecting, if you have collected the data for the 10 years, and you're thinking it's a mass national registry, and some people are already excluded, that could cause a lot of political challenges in the country. So I think that's important to think. So the main trade-offs, of course, is static snapshots. If you have a static snapshot, and I've explained again in terms of the challenges that could potentially come as a result of that, you perpetuate exclusion. That is one of the challenges that you have. Then if you're doing it more frequently, 2 to 3 years, there is a cost associated. If you're doing it on demand continuously, the way Valentina does, it means you've got to have these structures that can actually support this particular process. Then, of course, there is an infrastructure of unique identifier, which some countries don't. And then I think the most interesting, we did not find a country where after giving the data to the programs, there is a return of the data to update the registry. Because normally the fear is about the programs having their own structures and also having their own frameworks to ensure they also maintain the accuracy. So there has not been a precedent where a program also brings back the data. But I think there is also a lot of interest and among some of the stakeholders that it's not a question of the registry giving to the programs. There should be back information coming to the program. I think, Valentina, you want to comment on that?
I actually wanted to add a fifth challenge, which is actually, even if you do have a scheduled deadline, you say, I'm going to do a survey every 3 years. But then the 3-year deadline comes, maybe there's a new government, maybe you haven't got the right funding that year, so the timing slips, and it slips to the next year, it slips to the one after. So I think it's very rare, I've seen, that countries have actually managed to maintain that 3-year target.
Yeah.
So it's always, they say 2 to 3 years, and then it tends to be 3 to 4, 4 to 5. So Sanjay also wants to say something.
And this goes back to the discussion Richard, you and I were having yesterday.
Yeah.
I think because we see this data collection as an exercise distinct from the regular census and distinct from the normal ongoing data collection, that is why all these problems are actually manifestation of that, of that philosophy.
Yeah.
If you somehow try and strengthen either your census or all the programmatic data, like all the ministries, I can share with you in, like say in India, where we have huge ministries which are very powerful. So there's a Ministry of Rural Development, which looks after all the rural areas. There's a Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, which does an education and health and so on and so forth. All of them have scheduled surveys at different periodicities, 2 years or 3 years, which they do.
Yeah.
Now, doing something like this would be disastrous in a country like India, because on the top of all these surveys, you are now propagating yet another survey, and thereby creating a situation whereby there will be a discord between what the ministries are collecting and what your national database is collecting.
Yeah.
So I think this is just a question to everybody, in the sense that why do we always visualize the social protection database or registry as a distinct exercise which requires distinct data collection? Why can't we agree to a standard like a Dublin core metadata format or any other standard which defines the fields and say these are the 16 or 17 or 18 fields? We don't care what additional information you collect, but you must collect these 16, 17 fields as part of your regular data collection.
I think just to respond to that, Sanjay, it's going to come up as we discuss the links to other database. I think we did some research some time ago, and we are trying to say, for example, there is need for a distinction between essential information, which means what is the key information that does not frequently change, including, for example, the names, the age, the dates of birth, some essential, anything that describes which is normally found as part of the national ID systems. It's actually number of, so I'm going to actually to touch a bit when we actually talk about linkages. So whatever you're actually mentioning, you are saying there is a core set of essential information that does not frequently change. But for the social protection programs, there is another additional set of socioeconomic indicators that these particular programs actually need to determine targeting. And for that particular piece of information, what happens is it changes. It also changes actually quite frequently. So you cannot actually maintain. I think, Valentina, you want to actually maybe add more?
I was not referring to the common data which is contained in a unique ID. I was talking about the specific indicators. See this 29-page questionnaire.
These are the socio-economic indicators.
Exactly. Exactly.
So two more comments on that. So first of all, there's that statistical agency problem. So a lot of these surveys are run by the statistical agency, and they, in most countries, all countries, in fact, even in Indonesia, they're not allowed to share, in theory, personal identifying information. There's also an issue that many of the surveys that would be most useful, so household budget surveys, they're sampled surveys in most countries. So a sample survey wouldn't be sufficient for a social protection database, and that's part of the problem. I don't know if someone wants to add another reason why some of the existing data sources sometimes aren't right, unfortunately, because of course it would be fantastic to piggyback. But that's again why an integrated model by which you're drawing data from many different data sources, thanks to a unique identifier, is also ideal, because you're drawing from administrative data sources, which actually cover the whole population, not sample surveys.
Richard, I am a bit confused now. Yeah, okay, just the quick one. You were saying about the international, when you are talking about the international best practice, you are in your paper, in the figure 4 approaches.
Yeah.
So out of the 4 approaches, you are talking about the first approach, if I understood correctly, the centralized model one.
I think
When we are talking about the international best practice, the ranking and all the central level, if you go back to the previous slide. Yeah, so scoring and ranking completed at central level.
Yeah.
So is it not that we are talking about the out of the 4 approaches, the first approach is you are identifying? No?
No.
So can you explain a bit?
Can I say something? I think we can talk about this during the break rather than, because we're actually late on schedule.
Yeah.
So I can clarify this, and we better move on because we've got
we've got a bit of a very limited time, so I want to quickly brush through the remaining sessions. And I think I'm not even going to ask the question in terms of, I think we know from even yesterday's discussions that we need a form of unique ID. Okay, that's actually very, very clear. I think once we have these particular registries, we've got stories. Even the 16th century England industrializing because of actually having some form of unique ID. So I think that we are not going to emphasize, and it's a very critical pillar for the entire social protection and also for many other sectors. And you can see, for example, some very nice IDs which some countries have also tried to adopt. So where there is no form of unique ID like Brazil, you've got also some generated number by a federal central agency. So there are a number of options which countries have actually done to be able to actually deal with the issue of when there is no actually national ID system. So for Brazil, for example, they've got the social identification number, which actually replicates that. There could also be a unique number on the questionnaires for some programs. Of course, the challenges to do with the duplication and all that, which the systems have to be actually programmed to be able to actually do the cleaning. But these are some of the solutions that actually countries have actually evolved to be able to deal with this. So in terms of main trade-offs, if there is no unique ID, sometimes, again, ID system is actually taken by people because you need to access a service. So again, the biggest issue is the poorest, whom we are trying to reach using our social protection programs, may not actually want to actually, or may not actually need this particular ID. So what happens in that particular case is you may actually exclude if you actually use ID as a primary tool to be able to actually push them into that. Then of course there is a bit of an initial capital cost of setting up these particular IDs and a bit of timeline. There's a bit of all this, and there are processes countries have actually done. They can partner with national registration bureaus to be able to actually help in terms of reaching this particular target group. So there are options actually of actually dealing with that. But Valentina, a quick one.
No, I think one best practice is for social protection programs, as they're registering individuals into the programs, they can also have an outreach to make sure that these people get a national identification for free. So that's something that a couple of countries have done. You already have a process in place for registering, so you can also register for national ID.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important best practice.
Yeah. So, and then I think we moved to the technology issues. And I think in terms of the technology, we seem not to have a big issue on this. So I'm just going to more or less like explain briefly the key ones. One of it is, of course, is on the data privacy. And of course, I think on this particular one, I think we need to be adhering to the best international practice in terms of data privacy. And again, it's a bit of a balance, because we are asking Turkey, how do you balance between the consent, sharing the information with another party, with the privacy issues? Because I think it's a big concern. And I know, for example, most European countries don't have a national ID for that particular reason. It's a question of, why does the government have to know my details? So I think it's a bit of a very interesting model actually to see that Turkey, which is actually between Asia and Europe, is able to actually be able to deal with, to actually balance the two. They're able to get a consent from the beneficiary, and they're able to link to all these other particular databases. Yeah. Then you have the transfer of information. Sometimes it's batch process. It's not always. I know, for example, in Brazil, there is a bit of an offline process of collecting the data, and then it's actually subsequently transferred to the central database. So you've got a bit of all that. Where there is a connectivity, where the connectivity is not a big of a problem, then of course you can do a bit of online system. And you could see, for example, yesterday, the demonstration from Turkey. Very, very online system. We are accessing it from Indonesia, Jakarta, and it's actually being hosted in Turkey, Ankara. You've got the hardware, and I think hardware has not been a problem. I think the biggest thing in terms of the examples is you need adequacy. Once the specifications are actually defined, I don't think that is particularly a problem. But what I've seen is there is a new trend now to host things virtually. So the traditional approach where you sit with a server in your office and you protect it, and then you have a very big padlock and take care of it, is actually moving away. Things are, people talk about cloud, where you host it. But again, that has to be balanced. I've realized that most governments are very sensitive about sharing, putting their data. Where is the cloud being hosted? Is it in America? And is your country, it's going. Okay. Backup and security. Backup and security, quickly again. That is not, backup and security, again, it goes to, we need to conform with the best international practices. There is an ISO standard that actually deals with that and speaks to that. It's called ISO 27001. So I think we can actually more or less like look more, because there's already a standard on that. In terms of software, what we found out is a number of countries actually don't do, the traditional approach has been to write the specifications, document, and then give it to a programmer, they program that. But the best model we actually found from our research is there is continuous iteration, which is prototyping. You actually do a bit of a screen, you show it to the user, they give you the feedback. It increases ownership, it ensures that the user, there is no failure on the project, but it's more expensive. It's more expensive model, but it's actually a best model which is actually out there. We talk about the source code, and I think the best practice is actually to ensure that most countries are actually defining frameworks that ensure that there is ownership of the source code by the programs. It's not just going to be with the proprietor and it goes in a different way. So I think that is another best practice. In terms of the software, we are not going to check the questions again, sorry, because of that, I think because of the time. Thank you very much for listening.